Well, first of all, thank you to Erika and to the Abigail Adams Institute for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to see you all. And it's also a great pleasure to be included in the ranks of the fierce and forthright women who, like Louise and Mary, are challenging the terms of the debate. So, as mentioned, I'm the author of Rethinking Sex. And it did come out last spring, and I hope some of you have read it, and if not, you should get it immediately. But it's a book about the myths that we've been told, or sold, about sex, and about how they've warped our sexual and relational culture. It pushes against what feels like the 21st century modern understanding of what independence, desire, identity, even ethics means. It argues against the idea that consent is the only thing we need to have good sex. Spoiler alert, consent is a legal criterion, it's not an ethical one. And it's the floor, it was never meant to be the ceiling. But perhaps most importantly, it asks how we got to what seems like a dark place, one in which women, but also men, are experiencing less flourishing, not more. So how did we get here? Often, feminism is pointed to as the culprit. You hear it on Fox News, any sort of conservative bro with a podcast. Sorry guys, it's true. But I would argue that it isn't in fact feminism. I think that the movement has been co-opted. The original feminist movement did advocate for freedom, specifically for women to have the social, economic, and political freedom that would allow them to make their own choices about their own lives, rather than have their experience be defined by or dictated to by men. But an understanding of what this freedom looks like has shifted over time, subtly, but strongly. The mid-century, what we might call second wave vision of feminism and sexual revolution was a utopian one of equality between men and women, allowing both the freedom to experience a life more fully human. Babies too. Success here would depend upon a cultural and personal revolution in which both genders were equally valued. True freedom would demand equal sharing of power, resources, influence, and respect. And sexuality in particular, as Germaine Greer wrote in 1970, must be rescued from the traffic between powerful and powerless, masterful and master, to become a form of communication between potent, gentle, tender people. So this total transformation of society would be a heavy and disruptive shift. But of course, a different conversation about what freedom might look like was happening at the same time. This one would take advantage of women's newfound ability to have unconstrained sex due to a new access to over-the-counter contraception, but leave the more intractable questions of parity, value, and the ultimate aims of revolution by the wayside. And it was fueled less by the dedicated women who aimed for utopia than by Playboy's Hugh Hefner and Cosmopolitan's Helen Gurley Brown, and by capital, which wanted as much access as possible to women's time and bodies, without regard to their ultimate well-being. And, as they often do, our rapacious desires and short-term thinking markets won out. So yes, the early feminist movements actually did have a really revolutionary cause in mind. It was the smashing of a patriarchal system that centered male preferences and toxic value systems, replacing it with a new vision in which women and their distinctive concerns were equally valued and respected. But in our modern moment, girl boss feminism and lean-in feminism have asked for less. Rather than dismantling a male-dominated system, they redefined female progress as just gaining power within it, which meant adopting its values. So, a boss is still the ideal. You could just be a girl woman, and a playboy is fine. Ideal even, as long as women can be play girls. The equality that this, what I almost term post-feminism, suggests is that women rather, settle for the equal opportunity to be like the worst kind of man. This looks like idealizing detachment, staying liberated by not caring, and making sure that relationships never come before career goals. On dating apps especially, it brings a capitalist mindset to our interactions, making it normal to use, discard, and objectify other people. For instance, as I write about in the book, the woman who told me about ordering a guy off Tinder, like a pizza, to prove that she too had the power to have no strings attached sex. And I know we're all three going to speak here, so I do want to be fairly short, but just to push a little bit harder on this, I'll pull out one term that I think has been co-opted without our consent, and is particularly ripe for a rethinking. And that phrase is sex positivity. So originally, sex positivity meant something quite specific. In Lust Horizons, the 1981 essay in which the feminist Ellen Willis coined the phrase, she defined being pro-sex in part as the refusal to accept a spurious moral superiority as a substitute for sexual pleasure, and curbs on men's sexual freedom as a substitute to real power. So this was a specific critique aimed at a particular ideal circulating in the feminist movement at the time, the so-called anti-sex view suggesting that heterosexual encounters were always tainted by gender inequality, and that political celibacy and political lesbianism were actually the only correct responses to sex under the patriarchy. I think we can agree that this is a fairly extreme position, and that it makes sense that there was some pushback. And yet, in the same essay in which Willis coined the term sex positive, she went on to point out that it wasn't only killjoy anti-sex feminists who might actually ruin sex for all of us. If self-proclaimed arbiters of feminist morals stifle honest discussion with their dogmatic, guilt-mongering judgments, sexual libertarians often evade honest discussion by refusing to make judgments at all. And here we are today. Today, the term sex positive has completely ballooned in scope. Within what feels like contemporary feminism, the phrase has become a general shorthand for a willingness to be up for anything when it comes to sex. Up for anything, often with anyone, with an emphasis on adventurous. A way to prove your feminist bona fides. This contemporary redefinition of sex positivity is non-political, unlike the original feminist movement, and capitalistic, again, unlike the original feminist movement. And of course, it sidesteps that pesky question of morality. It's divorced from questions of oppression, and it discards larger social goals. So is it still the same thing at all? At this point, I think that we need to question everything that we've been told or sold. The earliest sex-positive feminists were against moralizing. They were suspicious of checks on sexuality that posed as morality, but sprang from sexual repression of the hierarchical, undeserved kind. But even they saw clearly the risks of assuming too easily that desire and its outcomes were completely beyond critique. In the same essay in which she coined the term pro-sex feminism, Willis again wrote, "Though self-definition is a necessary starting point for any liberation movement, it can take us only so far. The further this principle is extended, the sharper are its contradictions. A truly radical movement must look beyond the right to choose and keep focusing on the fundamental questions. Why do we choose what we choose? And what would we choose if we had real choice? Uncritical sex positivity isn't asking any of that. So, why now then? My process for writing Rethinking Sex was research that grew out of my column writing in the wake of the Me Too movement. It was data, but it was also interviews. Tons and tons of interviews with young women and also men about their sex lives, their relationships, their hopes for the future or lack thereof. And in doing those interviews, I found that many people, in fact, most, don't really understand what story they're living, or why they do what they do, or why they hew to the beliefs they've been told. I spoke to so many people, but women especially, who confessed that they pursued a sex life that was casual and meaningless and free, but actually left them feeling empty inside. Because that's what being modern meant, right? You live in a big city, you're urban. This is what feminists do, explore. There's one woman in particular I spoke to who described that how for her, modern feminism had meant internalizing the idea that having tons of casual sex as a woman would somehow subvert the double standard, and that if women just managed to fuck without feelings, her term, they too could be free. But she later realized that she was actually just imitating a stance that she found degrading and dehumanizing. That her feminism had been co-opted by a patriarchal norm. And indeed, who actually benefits from the concept of chill, a world of responsibility-free sex, the putting off or forgetting about entirely the bearing of children and the growth of families, the normalizing of medical interventions that tell women that it's better for them, their lives will be easier if they turn their bodies into something else. I don't think it's women who benefit. And so I don't think that's feminism. So yes, we've got to start asking questions. We're overdue for a rethinking. Is feminism just libertinism for ladies? I say no. Is it feminist to suggest that to succeed in the world, a woman should be, as Rex Harrison sings in My Fair Lady, more like a man? Again, no. Chief among those questions that we should ask, and that I'm very excited to talk about today, is what did the feminist movement actually aim to achieve? And what did it actually get? Why is there such a delta between what I think was the original vision and where we are now? In a conversation just yesterday night, I was asked whether I still identify as a feminist, and I replied, of course. Do I believe that women are of equal dignity to men and deserve equal rights and respect? Yes. Do I believe that women should be able to make their own choices about their lives? Absolutely. What I would emphasize, though, is that a true feminism is one in which women are respected as women in their specificity. One that pushes society to make room for women, not one that asks women to change themselves to fit into its existing destructive structures. The feminist movement was, and is, An opportunity to create a culture that values something other than economic success, total work and complete autonomy. One that valorizes things like relationship, emotion, and care, instead of downgrading them because they've been traditionally seen as female concerns. We have a chance to make space for female concerns, to move away from seeing maleness as a standard, one that women need to emulate. Is feminism still essential? Absolutely. But let's get clear on what it means. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Next up, Louise Perry.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, everyone, so much for having us here. So I'm coming up to the 12-month anniversary of my book being published, The Case Against Sexual Revolution. And I was recalling earlier, about this time last year, my publisher released on the website the cover of the book, which is, if anyone has seen it, is fairly provocative in and of itself, and also the chapter titles. Now, I designed these chapter titles to be prescriptive statements that were sort of designed, I'll be honest, to be deliberately what the blogger Scott Alexander once called scissor statements. So to one side, they look obviously true, to the other side, they look obviously outrageous. So and they include chapter titles like Sex Must Be Taken Seriously, Consent is Not Enough, Violence is Not Love, and the one that really, really got me in trouble on Twitter, which was Men and Women Are Different. And so my chapter titles got shared online, they got retweeted by Ben Shapiro, and and I had quite a hard few days on Twitter, and I thought, wow, this is what I'm in for. And I was at that point where I was thinking, have I ruined my life by writing this book? It remains to be seen whether or not I have. And it was the Men and Women Are Different one that really, really got people angry, / many other people looked at that and said, well, of course, I mean, why would you even need to say it? It turns out in 2022, 2023, you do need to say it. And it is a premise on which I base my argument, and it is, I think, also a premise on which we are all thinking, everyone on this panel. The sexual evolution was I think two things. It was a material event, particularly related to the pill. The pill enters our lives. The first time in the history of the world, it becomes possible for women to regulate their fertility in a way that they can control themselves in an invisible way. You know, you have the woman who appears fertile but is in fact infertile entering the world. And in some senses, I think she should be understood as a distinct biological creature. And then, of course, you have all of the changes to the economy, to technology, and so on, which I think Mary's going to speak more on. The other thing that happens at exactly the same time is you have this enormous ideological shift, which I think we're going to, in the future, look back on as being something like a second Reformation. But if the first Reformation was about the rejection of Catholicism, this Reformation has been about the rejection of Christianity, full stop. And that de-Christianization process is ongoing. And it was in train even before the 1960s, but it really, the 1960s was a crucial moment of acceleration. So those two things happen at the same time. And I think it's now that we are coming to start to reckon with what the sexual revolution really was and what it has really meant and whether or not it was a good thing. I think it was a mixed thing. I've written a case against it. There's a case against to be made. There are also obviously trade-offs in every direction. And I don't want to fall into the trap of idealizing the past, because people in the past were just as flawed as we are now. But this question of the differences between men and women. So there are other physical differences between men and women, which I think we should all be well aware of. I say this, they are obviously enormously contentious in a way that I think people in other times and places would be extremely surprised by. But I'm just going to say it. You know, half of the population can get pregnant, the other half of the population can do the impregnating. Women are substantially smaller and weaker than men in ways that have obvious social salience when you're thinking about men and women being alone together. Essentially, almost all men can kill almost all women with their bare hands, but not vice versa. The more difficult topic is the psychological differences, because they are more slippery. And because we're talking about average differences in certain traits, there's a lot of overlap, there are a lot of outliers, there are a lot of people who have a sort of unusually masculine or feminine personalities relative to their sex. It's hard to pin down in the way that you can pin down, upper body strength. But I start from the premise that those psychological differences exist. The analogy that I've heard used by some evolutionary psychologists is that if you think of male and female faces, we know that every single feature on your face is going to be somewhat influenced by your sex. So for instance, men have heavier brows than women do on average. Men have bigger noses than women do on average. Men have squarer jaws than women do on average. But we also know that every single one of those traits varies and can really be understood as two overlapping bell curves. Some women have big noses, some men have unusually round chins, etc. Having said that, human beings are extraordinarily good at guessing the sex of a human face as soon as they see it. Indeed, guessing the sex of a human figure from a distance is one of the things that we are extremely good at as a species, but for obvious evolutionary reasons. Excuse me, I've got. And I think the same applies to psychology. If we think of, say, a feature like sociosexuality, which I write about a great deal because it's extremely important to my argument. Sociosexuality is the term that psychologists use to describe your interest in sexual variety. It's not quite the same as your sex drive. You can be high in one and low in the other, but it's a trait that on average differs substantially between men and women, and I don't think I need to tell anyone in the room in what direction it differs by, okay? There is quite a lot of overlap. There are outliers in every possible direction. Think of it like, the human nose. Men in general will have bigger noses than women. Men in general will be higher in sociosexuality than are women, but there is lots of variation. And the central idea in my book is that what we have seen in post-sexual revolution has been an attempt to socially encourage women to drag the bell curve upwards towards the male standard, for women to imitate masculine style of sexuality, to be more interested in sexual variety, as Christine's been speaking about, to have sex like a man. That's the phrase that's used in the first episode of Sex and the City, which is enormously influential, obviously, in this cultural history. It's not just sociosexuality, though. There are a lot of other psychological components, just like facial features, where we see these differences. And yes, there are outliers in every one, but we are very good as humans at spotting male and female faces, and we are also very good as humans at spotting masculine and feminine personalities. And that's a very hard thing to say in a feminist context, where the battle for so long has been about denying that there are any psychological differences between men and women. I mean, we've even reached the point where we've denied that there are any physical differences between men and women. That, until right this moment, has been the project. How do we align the differences between men and women in every possible way? How do we make women more like men? That has really what the project has been about all along. We've seen this enormous influx of women into historically male-dominated professions, historically male-dominated roles and domains over the last 60 or so years. We have not seen men in general clamouring to pick up the washing up gloves, clamouring to do the childcare. We have not seen a counterpart rush of men into female domains. The project overall has been about how do you make women more like men, including in terms of course, of sexuality. But if we were to accept the idea that women are different, not just physically, but psychologically, if we were to accept the idea that actually there are certain things, for instance casual sex, that men are always going to enjoy and seek out more than are women. And if we were to move away from the idea that women ought to be more like men, which I think is rooted very deep down in an idea that women are in some sense worse than men, and that actually that feminine constellation of psychological traits, that female face, is in some senses worse, is in some senses lower status, and ought to be resisted and moved beyond. If we were to start from the premise that, okay, if we know, and Holland shows us this consistently, that women actually like to stay home with their children more than men do, that women like to have monogamous committed relationships generally more than do men, that women like to do certain professions more often than men do. What if we were to accept that and make that our starting point for a constructive feminist politics and say, okay, in what ways therefore does the law need to change? In what ways does government policy need to change in order to allow women to have the choice, yes, to be more like men, recognizing that there are outliers in every direction, recognizing that I'm talking in generalizations deliberately, but that there are going to be all sorts of people for whom this isn't true. But if we were to recognize that actually there is such a thing as a typical female psychology, and that it's not a bad thing, that I hope is the starting point on which we might be able to rethink feminism, a kind of feminism that actually serves women's interests, rather than trying to make us more like men in every possible way.
And now Mary.
Thank you, Christine and Louise, and thank you so much, Erika, for having us, and all of you for coming. This is a great honour. It's wonderful to be here. I gather from Erika that among the audience there's a group of seniors from a local girls' school. I want to address these words to you guys in particular, because if anyone has skin in the game where it comes to rethinking feminism, it's you. I'm middle-aged. You guys really have skin in the game. So I want to talk a bit about how I arrived at what my colleague Erika calls sex realist feminism, which is, I think, the very much more respectable cousin of what I call reactionary feminism. I'll talk a bit about how my stance contrasts with the more mainstream orthodoxy, which I think is what we're all in different ways proposing to rethink. Usually, I think, we can call liberal feminism. And I'll argue that what sails under this banner is now more accurately a form of transhumanism. And I'll offer some reflections on why, against that, we must uphold a feminism which is grounded in the reality that Louise has so beautifully expressed just now, that men and women exist. So, in order to get us there, I wanted to make a brief detour into the before times. In 2 points in the before times, really. Really to a world where, if you'd suggested that we should treat men and women the same, people would have looked at you like you were nuts. And they would have been right to do so, actually. And I'm going to look at this through two familiar feminist lenses, which is work and also sex. So if you can imagine a world where most work is not something which happens in an office, but in the physical world, say a field, a home, a kitchen, or a workshop. That's not so long ago, maybe a couple of centuries. And in Feminism Against Progress, which came out this week in the US, I've argued that in that material context, everyone worked, because the primary economic unit was not individuals as it is today, it was the household. And people mostly worked, men and women both, on subsistence tasks connected to keeping the household going. For example, making food, producing or processing raw materials, and so on. So there wasn't any meaningful sense in which men were economically active and women were economically passive, chief consumers. It just didn't work like that. Men typically did different work. They'd do the more physically arduous stuff, like ploughing. And women would do the would more typically in that situation be processing raw materials around the care of children. In the book, I've given the example of textile making as a classic example of women's work. 20,000 years, it has been typically women's work. Because you can raise a loom off the ground, you can be interrupted if the toddler is trying to eat something they shouldn't eat. It's social. It works. It makes sense. And the family needs fabric for all kinds of purposes. So it's important work, but it's traditionally been women's work. So this is the before times in terms of work. But that all changed when the world industrialized. At that point, things shifted dramatically for women. Because if you go back to the example of textile making, at that point, after industrialization, you don't have women weaving at home with a toddler underfoot, or perhaps many toddlers underfoot. What you have is big, dangerous, expensive machinery, which is centralized in a factory. So under those circumstances, textile making if you have a toddler, you think, what do you do with the baby? You can't very well have them running around under these dangerous machines. So women had a whole set of new dilemmas. Do we choose work or children? What do we do if we have to work? Who cares for our kids if we have to work? If we don't work, can we trust our husbands to take care of us? If our husbands don't step up, how do we make our way in the world? These are a whole new different set of problems. And from this and related dilemmas, we emerged the entire early women's movement, which really starts from Mary Wollstonecraft, who gives her name to Erika's Institute. And in that early women's movement, I've identified two distinctive strands. So there were advocates for the continued importance of those activities that remained in the home even after work left. For care, for example, motherhood, the early education of children, and a space of respite from the rigours of the marketplace. And I've called this the feminism of care and interdependence. And then against that, there were also women who advocated for women's right to enter the market on the same terms as men, as individuals, which I think we could call the feminism of freedom. Now, today we live primarily under the feminism of freedom, and care is a very poor relation, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But even while they wrestled with these dilemmas, women still understood that men and women existed, men and women were physically different. Pregnancy risk was 100% asymmetrical. I mean, it still is, but we pretend it isn't. Again, in that context, we need to look at the sexual before times to see how we got to a point where we could pretend that men and women didn't exist, or that sex was not something asymmetrical. And the so-called sexual double standard that you've talked about, that both of you have spoken to, as a central bone of contention within feminism, it's usually treated by feminist historiography as evidence of patriarchy. But if you think about the before times, even a century ago, if you'd said women's sexual behaviour was the business only of an individual woman, everyone would think you were nuts. Because if you imagine a world where there's no reliable way of preventing conception if you have sex, there's no pill you can take, there's no technology you can use, in that world, and there's a material possibility that if you do get it on, a baby is going to result, and that baby is everybody's problem, it's not just yours. And under those circumstances, if you're female, who you have sex with and when really is everybody's business. So the back and forth between the feminism of care and the feminism of freedom happened in a context where everyone still accepted that sex asymmetry. It doesn't feel very fair from a modern perspective that things should have been so asymmetrical. But in that context, women's sexuality was policed very much more heavily than that of men for very pragmatic reasons. And what I want to suggest, and what I hope to show, is that it's an illusion of the age we now inhabit that it could ever possibly have been fair, that biology ever really could be fair. And these before times, the times where people accepted that sex asymmetry was just a thing, we had to work with it. And that ended with the pill, which both Christine and Louise have noted as a point of radical departure from where we were before. And I want to dig into why and how that was a radical departure. So it inaugurates a new age of relatively consequence-free sex. And this is all of a sudden this technology comes along that enables women to radically flatten, pretty reliably flatten the most salient difference, the most salient material difference, which is keeping the way women are treated distinct from the way men are treated in terms of social mores and sexual behaviour. And so for the first time ever, it's thinkable that women's sexual behaviour is a matter for her and her alone. It simply wasn't possible to suggest that before because people would just think, no, that's just not true. And there were a huge number of upsides to this. I mean, I'm a net beneficiary of a whole load of those upsides. Women could plan. If you were clever, you were ambitious, you wanted to work. I mean, my grandmother was a doctor. And she stopped working when she got married, because those were the circumstances prior to the pill that women just had to deal with. Fast forward a couple of generations to me, and it's just not meaningful to you. I was in a position where I could go to university and know that I could have as many years as I wanted to do whatever I wanted to. So there's this huge acceleration in opportunities for ambitious women. But that's not the only thing that comes with the pill. I mean, Christine mentioned the Hugh Hefnerization and the co-optation of sexual liberation. And in Feminism Against Progress, I've suggested that it's not actually possible to have the utopianism. It's not possible to have the liberation without also having the commodification. Because if I can do as I please with my body, that means that really means I can do as I please with my body, and that opens out onto a libertarian defence of the sex industry. It means I can sell it if I want to. I mean, why shouldn't I? What business is it of anybody else what I do with my body? So Downstream of that, we see a boom in the sex industry. We see a boom in pornography. By the 1970s, radical feminists were protesting the sex industry. I dare say a great many of those feminists, you'd have prized the pill from their cold dead hands. But essentially it was that technology which was enabling the gross degradation and proliferation of exploitative pornography that they were protesting. You can't have the liberation without the Hefner. So to sum up so far, if you'd said to someone prior to the Industrial Revolution that men and women should be equal in the workplace, they'd probably have laughed. If you'd said prior to the sexual revolution that men and women should be equal in the sexual marketplace, which incidentally is a term that only comes into being with the 1960s, because at the point where women's sexuality is privatized, it can also be marketized. But at that point, we get the term sexual marketplace, which doesn't even exist before. You'd probably have got the same reaction. People would have thought you were nuts. So we look back on those times and we feel good about how much more advanced we are now. But a great deal of what got us here wasn't moral progress, it was technology. So now, we can draw a parallel between the women's activism that followed on from the Industrial Revolution and the women's activism that followed on from the sexual revolution. In both cases, men and women set out to renegotiate their roles in the light of new technologies. But the difference between those two shifts is that industrialization was about breaking through limits out there in the world. How fast you could weave or how fast you could travel, for example. The sexual revolution has turned that inward and set about industrializing the human body. And it's hard to overstate what a paradigm shift this was. I take the pill really as the inaugural example of this paradigm shift, this beginning of the process of industrializing the human body, and particularly women's bodies. Because the pill doesn't fix something that's broken, like, say, a medication that treats my faulty kidney. It breaks something that's working fine, and it does so in the interests of desire. And that's a radical transformation in what we think medicine does. So it's the first medicine that set out to upgrade normal human physiology in line with individual desire. And that brought a huge dividend of freedom, opportunity, wealth, productivity, especially for the most ambitious women who are best placed to take advantage of those new opportunities. But with it has come a host of undercounted downsides, and also a new paradigm for emancipation that travels under the banner of feminism, but is more accurately a libertarianism of the body, or to put it more plainly, transhumanism. Specifically, in the domain of feminism, this transhuman turn that began with the pill made it possible to believe for the first time that men and women could go beyond just balancing our sometimes competing interests, but instead we could medicate away the body asymmetries that gave rise to those differences. It began with the sexual double standard and that utopianism that Christine describes, but it hasn't stopped there. Because if we can use technology to halt conception, we can use it to control conception. If we can use tech to flatten fertility in the name of self-actualization, we can use tech to induce fertility for the same purpose. But the resulting freedom creates a vacuum that ends up being filled by the market. If it's possible to believe that who I have sex with is solely my private business, so too, if I choose to sell my body, that's nobody's business. But this doesn't just stop with the sex industry. Technologies that start or stop fertility also deliver the multi-billion-dollar fertility industry. So what, you might say? It's a free country, blessings of liberty, etc. But technologies that promise to free us from our nature actually just turn that nature into a supply and demand problem. So male sexual desire and female beauty. Louise has noted the normative differences between male and female preferences where it comes to mate choice. This is something that Louise addresses magnificently in her book. Those normative differences are now merrily exploited by big porn. The fact that men like looking at beautiful women. This is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in these new markets, and it doesn't stop there. There's only one sex that can sell their eggs. Only one sex who find themselves unexpectedly sterilised by unfortunate complications of having sold their eggs. So the only children they'll ever have will be gestated by somebody else. In these new markets, there are winners and losers, such as those women. Typically, the elite social class gets all the freedom, and the lower orders get all the trade. Or rather, they find that they themselves are being traded. Women in the global south, for example, can be pressured into commercial surrogacy, and then ostracised by their villages afterwards, having earned the money. Young women rendered infertile after egg donation. And as well, it demolishes social boundaries that seem unnecessary if you're rich and comfortable and well situated in a low crime area, but that are actively harmful lower down the social scale. If it's sexist to assume I might become a mother based on being female, it follows logically that it's sexist to assume a woman should necessarily be female at all. And to think otherwise would be to accept that there remain some ways that our bodies constrain us. And biolibertarian feminism is popular among those women who live in the world of ideas, which is to say elite women. This group is now working merrily under the name of feminism to abolish sex in law and culture, and believes this, genuinely, sincerely believes that in doing so they're changing the world for the better. And many of these women don't think, or don't care, I don't know, but I think I would prefer to think don't think about those places where it might impact those for whom sex still really does matter. It's in their interests to ignore this. Because if you're a lawyer or similar, you're an accountant or a Big Four management consultant, sex doesn't really matter very much, at least not until you have kids. But to, for example, an incarcerated woman who might end up locked up in a cell with somebody who still has a fully working set of male gangly bits, sex really does matter. You know, especially when that individual could kill you with his bare hands, their bare hands, and the same is not true, as Louise puts it. So this is those women with the most power pursuing their class interest to the detriment of those women with the least. And as an old leftist, I find this grossly unjust. But there's more. To be a bi-libertarian is to want not men and women, but post-sex people, unconstrained by our bodies. It's thus the enemy of feminism properly understood. It provides no conceptual foundation from which to defend those areas, such as sport or prison, where single sex is obviously more just and more kind and better. It justifies turning our bodies into a product and marketplace by saying, I own myself. It promises freedom from human nature, but succeeds only in turning that nature into a set of supply and demand problems. It entrenches class inequalities and rigs the game in favour of those women at the top. So when I argue for rethinking feminism, I mean pushing back against the illusion that we can be freer by using tech to flatten every embodied difference. I believe in pushing back against the delusion that we can use tech to escape our nature. And I believe in calling out the hidden class asymmetries which are bound up in tech-enabled biolibertarian promises of freedom. The people whose bodies become a workplace or product or simply a raw material to be strip-mined. I call out the erasure of mothers in human reproduction. This erasure is being cheered on by the class of women who can afford to subcontract gestation and in the process do violence to the needs of babies. And I call out the rapidly multiplying negative consequences for normal women of seeking to abolish the cultural, legal and political standing of biological sex. In place of these profoundly anti-feminist ideas, I propose that as starting points, we aim for political resistance on all fronts against the tyranny of unisex life. That we should reject the totalitarian sexual industrial complex, and we should withdraw, as to the best of our abilities, our store of sexuality altogether from the so-called marketplace. We should embrace realism about the limits of gender neutrality. We should defend single-sex spaces for both women and men. We should lean into our embodiment. Men and women exist. We're equal in dignity and capacity for excellence, but we're not the same. Young women of Boston's excellent colleges, you are enjoying an elite education in some of America's finest schools. Many of you will, I imagine, go on to college and probably high-paid careers. When you do, I urge you to remember that not every woman can live in the dematerialized world of information and ideas. When or if you do choose whether to rethink feminism and choose which side you come down on, the biolibertarian side or the sex realist side, I urge you to remember that for all women, and especially when or if we become mothers, that sex is still real. And I urge you to remember those women with less power than you'll likely have, and who rely on your willingness to speak the truth, even when it can seem hurtful, that humans can't change sex, and that our nature, including our sex, is not a set of oppressive constraints, but a foundation for us to flourish together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So I'm actually going to invite Louise to just stand near the microphone because we only have one.
I have a very quiet voice, so this is
It's better.
a special stool for the child.
So I was wondering if any of you have questions for one another before I have a question, and then we'll open it up for questions. Any of you have, Christine, now that you've heard these two, do you have any questions or?
Well, I don't know if this is a question
For a comment, sure.
comment. Yeah, maybe. That's like the worst thing to hear in a lecture hall. Was there a question? It's like more like a comment. Nobody came to do comments. One thing that I'm very interested in this debate, and as both of you continue to rethink feminism, is also pushing past the just material questions to almost second order questions. I think that there's something that both of you talk about that needs to be highlighted both in our thinking about women and gender, but in our thinking about all areas of society. This idea that unconstrained, that freedom, that individuality is our highest goal. It somehow seems like one of the things that we are all three pressing back against is that this is held as the ideal, that being alone and fully autonomous is the best way to be, and how that idea has co-opted feminism, perhaps, but is seen in all sorts of other spaces. So what other kind of underlying, second order questions are we missing here? I'm thinking also about the idea of equality, Mary, that you talked about, the idea that to be equal, men and women have to be the same. Can we still say that there's equality if, there's difference? Obviously in the United States, I'm speaking about this clearly, the history of different but equal has very poor connotations. But what does that mean when it comes to physiology, the physiology that we can change and that which we can't? What are we really, talking about when we get past is it the pill or is it not the pill? Is it abortion or is it not abortion?
A beautiful example of this would be something like maternity leave, with a policy that permitted neither male nor female employees to take maternity leave would be an equal policy. It would also be much to women's cost. So, radical feminists have criticised equality, the idea of equality for some time now. It is difficult, though, to come up with a good alternative because, as you say, the historical resonances are bad, and also because it does oblige us to, Mary's spoken about this beautifully. There are some women who have done very well out of the last 60 years. Often women who have not just the advantages of wealth and influence, but women who are probably temperamentally just better suited to the kind of masculine ideal, which is now easier for us to access. Women who don't want to have children, women who are more interested in pursuing masculine careers, etc. Those women are going to chafe extremely hard against any effort to offer sort of officially different models.
And they also have the mic, as a rule.
Yeah. Sort of by definition, the women who are in the corridors of power are the women who are much less likely to have children, are much more masculine in every possible way. They really don't like this kind of politics. But as I think we've all laid out, there are serious costs to be borne by other women if we don't attempt some official recognition of male and female difference at every level.
So let me just throw in just another question about where men fit in all of this. There's certainly, been the rise of a figure like Andrew Tate is the one we all sort of call attention to often, but other sort of, I don't know if Andrew Tate calls himself a masculinist, but you sort of hear this of men who are sort of post-Christians in their outlook, even sort of pagan, even Nietzschean, and thinking that we need to sort of release male aggression and that's what it really means to be a man. And there are other models too. When Richard Reeves was here, kind of seeking a different model, looking especially at fatherhood. I guess I would ask what you all think about sort of how men fit into this project of rethinking feminism, especially on the idea of men and women having equal dignity.
I can go first again. This is also actually an area that I'm thinking about a lot. I'm working on an essay about masculinity for the Post right now. I think that the emphasis in the sort of co-opted modern feminism on being like a certain kind of man in particular is actually hurting men just as much. I think the breakdown in our sexual culture and our gender relationships is hurting men and women, not just women. I mean, there is something to be said for, actually I agree, I think, with what Louise was saying about this idea, this sort of haunting fear that if we acknowledge that men and women are different, we're also sort of acknowledging, or will be pushed to acknowledge somehow that the female version is just like a little bit worse. It's just the secondary one. It's the one that nobody really wants to be. And instead the radical opposite, get as far away from the feminine pole as you can towards the most aggressive version of masculinity, the Andrew Tate guy, that's who you should be, is the ideal for men. But actually that's a really unhealthy ideal for women to aspire to, but also for men to aspire to. If we categorize things like care, like emotion, like interdependence as female, and thus we want to downplay those, we want to get rid of that in the ideal of equality, we're also taking that away not just from women, but from men who deserve care, who should be expected to be interdependent with their communities, who should be allowed to show emotion, who probably also want to start families and to have good relationships with the women and girls in their lives. Andrew Tate actually, I think, describes himself not even as an extreme masculinist, but actually as an open misogynist. Like, he just says he's a misogynist. And I think that sort of stance of anger, of, I guess, antithesis towards both sort of normative masculinity and femininity altogether is something to beware of. Because in the end, we want a society in which men and women can work together, can live together, can love together, and can both be valued, not just one or the other.
Andrew Tate is I genuinely feel a huge amount of compassion for him. Seriously. Because his dad walked out on him when he was very young. He grew up, his dad was a well-known chess player, I believe, and left him in relative poverty in a really not very nice town in Britain called Luton. I live not far from Luton, it's really horrible. It's not somewhere I would recommend growing up. And so, when I look at this man as an adult and I look at everything he says, what I see is someone who's so well defended against the possibility that his dad abandoned him and the emotional implications of having been abandoned in that way by his father, that he's created an entire business empire predicated on teaching young men to impregnate women and then walk away, and persuading other young men that it's fine. And it's an extraordinary level of achievement in sort of defensive formation, and it's not one that I can endorse in any way. But what's fascinating about him and the fact that he has such resonance for so many young men is that he is in a sense he's acting as a mentor for all of these men, and he doesn't know that any of these, in most cases he doesn't know that these young men exist. And I'm thinking there's something very radically different between, if you compare that to the way male mentorship has historically worked. If you think about how an apprentice has historically been trained in a trade, they would join as maybe a 14-year-old boy, some kind of a trade, and be taught how to do things, typically by an older man, and in the process go through a kind of formation, probably of character as much as of skill, in the course of which they learn essentially how to be a man to a particular template. Something similar you might see in a military college traditionally, for a different social class. And what Andrew Tate is offering is a kind of dematerialized version of that, and one out of which all of the relationship and all of the intimacy and all of the interpersonal connection has bled. And I'm thinking, well, why is this happening? Where is the male mentorship in real life that would be the better, healthier, saner version of this? And I'm thinking some of this, my hypothesis is down to a widespread structural attrition of male social spaces. And a great deal of this has happened as part of a well-intentioned desire to make more of society co-ed,
some of which has been in pursuit of equal access to the corridors of power for women. But further down the food chain, again, banging on about class as I always am. But whereas yes, this has granted networking opportunities for women who want to become Supreme Court judges, great. But further down the food chain, that's also led to an attrition of the kind of male spaces, which played a crucial role in the formation of the kind of young men who now follow Andrew Tate. And these were not men who were ever gatekeeping power or resources. They were just like the guys. And so when I think about how men fit into a picture of a more respectful and perhaps a more interdependent and less bio-libertarian understanding of equality that makes some space for those ways in which we exist and are different, I would suggest that might include being willing to step back and allow those spaces to reform and do their work of formation.
And I want to jump back in here actually, because I think you made a really good point about mentorship and the sort of training of men by other men. So in working on this essay that I'm working on, I talked to just like a lot of young guys, and so many of them were like, well, I almost don't know what it is to be a man. Like, I don't know what masculinity really is, because like, I don't know, I don't have a great relationship with my dad, or this is the community that I've grown up in. Like I don't have a map, like nobody's told me what to do. And to the extent that young men especially are looking for a map to masculinity, to how to grow up, and there's nothing there, if Andrew Tate is like there holding up a map and being like, this is the map, and also I've had like all these babes around, whatever, Bugattis, like most guys can tell you, he's kind of full of crap, but he exists. Like, he's there, he's providing at least something, and something is better than nothing. And so they'll go for that something. And even if, they understand that much of his misogynist posing is crap, if you listen to 10 hours a day or 10 hours a week of Andrew Tate, and 8 hours of it, if you actually watch his videos, are about like, get fit, like exercise, watch less porn, but then 2 hours are slap women in the face, be a pimp, train women to become cam girls for you. Like, you will just end up absorbing that part too, even if you think that you're not. So there's that. And then I think just the manosphere in general, to the extent that feminism, especially actually feminism in the, I think like early 2000s and 2010s, like became not necessarily about cooperation and a broader set of gentler, more tender, more potent people, as Greer put it, but as women drinking male tears and tweeting about how much they hate men and men should be banned. To the extent that feminism is seen as denigrating men, and that women should be replacing men in the roles that they used to have, not working with them. And to the extent that also feminism provides clear mentorship for women. There's the Abigail Adams Center. There's so many centers for women where finally women are being encouraged to do what they weren't allowed to in the past. And
God help you if you try and set something like that up just for men.
Yeah, men feel left out, I actually think. And that has caused a lot of resentment that then is often channeled into these very weird people and places. Like Tate, the number one example right now.
Two things to say on Andrew Tate, the man who launched 1,000 feminist think pieces. So the first is that, moving on from Christine's comments just now, is that there has been an emasculation of men, there has. And the question is that to do with feminism and the feminisation of public life? Maybe a bit. I think, though, that what's cut men a lot more than feminism is technology. It turns out it's a lot easier to automate traditionally masculine jobs than it is to automate traditionally feminine jobs. And that's likely to remain true for a good while longer, mostly because care is really hard to automate. And care jobs are dominated by women, typically low paid. I don't know what one does about that. I don't think UBI would solve it. I think UBI would make it worse, because I think men seem to have a very deep longing for work and meaning and purpose that can't be satisfied by being on the dole, essentially. The second thing to say about Andrew Tate is that he is not a patriarch, because the patriarch carries responsibility. The patriarch has a leadership role within the household. Andrew Tate does not want a leadership household within the household because he has abandoned every child he's ever sired. And really the model of masculinity that Tate is striving towards, and that many of his young fans, overwhelmingly very young teenage boys. I was asked recently if I knew anyone who's a fan of Andrew Tate, and I was like, I'm too old. I don't know any like 14-year-old boys who are apparently his main group of fans. The model of masculinity that they're attracted to is actually one based on fraternity. It's like no girls allowed in my treehouse kind of masculinity, plus pimping and Bugattis and so on. And I wonder if to some extent this is feeding off the fact that within traditional models of masculinity and femininity, both models contain both privileges and responsibilities. So in the traditional feminine role, I wonder if anyone's ever heard of the women are wonderful psychological bias. It's a biased notion in human cognition where people will typically choose to favour women in certain circumstances. So if you ask people, you know, would you choose to save a man or a woman from a burning building? People will typically choose to save the woman. It's the sort of Titanic, women, children first kind of principle. It's very widespread. People do seem, and it runs counter to some of the traditional feminist arguments in relation to patriarchy. It's not quite true that women are always disfavoured. It's more that women, one of the privileges of femininity is to some extent having that kind of being a beneficiary of benign sexism, to be protected in certain circumstances, to be prized in certain circumstances, you know, the beloved maternal figure. There is a privilege to that if you can attain that feminine status. It comes with complementary responsibilities to be the carer, to put your own needs secondary to those of the children and so forth. And of course, feminism has been typically very orientated towards rejecting those responsibilities. Masculinity has the same thing, you know, men do have a certain status, a sort of, I think often what people talk about when they talk about patriarchy is not actually a sort of traditional anthropological model where power is only invested in men. We don't live in one of those. We haven't lived in one of those for a very long time. You know, we haven't yet had a female president here, but we've had 3 female prime ministers in the UK. You know, the idea that women are officially excluded from positions of power is clearly outdated. I think what people mean when they talk about patriarchy is actually what I alluded to in my opening comments, that vague feeling that women are just a bit lower status than men are. You know, beloved potentially, and worthy of being protected potentially, but just a bit lower status. And it is true that one of the privileges of masculinity is to be the higher status, is to be the leader, is to be impressive, is to be brave, is to be valorized, etc. The cost to that is, well, the downside of being brave. You sometimes have to die. You sometimes have to die for the family, for your country, etc. Both masculinity and femininity have a yin and yang, you know, complementary upsides and downsides, to put it mildly. And what Andrew Tate does is he rejects all of the downsides of masculinity. He refuses to be the patriarch. He refuses to actually take responsibility for his children. Imagine asking Andrew Tate to die for his country. He won't even pay his taxes, right? Like he's completely divorced from any sense of responsibility for other people, and yet gets to enjoy, or tries to enjoy, all of the upsides of masculinity, and he sells this as a product to his young fans. And I think that to some extent that's an inevitable consequence of the queering agenda leading us to some extent treat gender like a consumable item. You can pick and mix your favourite bits. You can kind of slot together whichever components of masculinity and femininity will suit you best. But that's not a sustainable model because everyone inevitably is going to end up picking all the upsides and rejecting all the downsides. And I think Andrew Tate is just the male version of that.